On behalf of the Rutgers Newark Africana Studies Department, I'm delighted to welcome everyone tonight for the launch of Dr. Wendell Marsh's debut book, Textual Life, Islam, Africa, and the Fate of the Humanities. As a former chair of Africana Studies... It is an amazing book, so you want to get a copy. As a former chair of Africana Studies, I've had the immense honor and pleasure of witnessing Wendell developing his ideas and research over the last few years, and this amazing study is but one fruit of that vital intellectual and critical work. Special thanks to the Source of Knowledge, Bookstore, for being such generous hosts and for their decades. For their decades of service to the community of Newark, New Jersey. As a community center that centers Black art, Black literature, culture, and community, it is the perfect place to launch this work. As they note themselves, quote, we create space for young people to discover themselves amongst our shelves, for students to dig deeper into radical Black thought, and for local Newark artists to gather in community and love. I also want to thank the Institute for the Study of Global Racial Justice and the Mellon Foundation Sawyer Seminars, of which Wendell served as a co-organizer, for their sponsorship. With their support, students in attendance can receive a free copy of the book. In addition, an additional thanks goes to Christina Strasburger and Mina Yoon for their crucial role in making this event happen. We also will be joined by the brilliant Dr. R.A. Judy, who will give a fuller introduction of Wendell, including some personal reflections. I'll introduce R.A. and then I invite him to come up, well, he's already here, right? And introduce Wendell. I'll add that I believe we will have the current chair of Africana Studies, Dr. Dari Davis, providing closing remarks, I think when he gets here. And there will be a wonderful, as you can see, range of food and refreshments. So please get food and refreshments. If you haven't gotten them, please get them after the event is over. R.A. Judy is Professor of Critical and Cultural Studies in the Department of English at the University of Pittsburgh and is a member of the six-person editorship of Boundary 2, an international journal of literature and culture. The journal has published recent special issues critically engaging important topics, including crisis to catastrophe, lineages of the global new right, as well as a dossier, the Tunisian Revolution of Dignity. He is also a member of the editorial collective of Critical Productive, a journal dedicated to the intellectual project of culture, arts, and architecture, and on the advisory board of Liquid Blackness, I love that title, an online journal that seeks to carve out a dedicated space for aesthetic theory and the most radical agenda of Black studies to come together in productive ways, as well as on the editorial advisory board of comparative literature studies. And of course, he is a remarkable scholar, theorist, philosopher, and just brain.
So I've been given an interesting, complex mandate, and I'm going to select the mandate that I received from my good friend Wendell, because we're here to celebrate his book. And I think one of the best ways of celebrating the book is getting a sense of what it is and where it came from. So I've got a number of questions I want to ask him, but I'm going to preface them by pointing out that this is a work where the title speaks volumes, Textual Life. And that can be taken in two fundamental senses. One of the senses he talks about in the book is a life that's recorded in text. The other important sense that's at work in the very structure of the book is a fundamental notion we find in Islam in general and in a very profound way in the Senegambia and the Sahel region, and that is the living book. That is the practice of transmission, of isnad, where you don't just read a book by yourself, you read it collectively, and who you read it with is where the knowledge is transmitted, and your capacity to be a teller of tales is based upon the line of transmission with whom you're in. And this is a key element of what goes on with the key figure, Shaykh Musa, but it also goes on with Mr. Marsh. The way he comes to this book is old. Now, I first met Wendell in December of 2012 at an event at the Maison Française on France Fanon, when he and a group of Arab students corralled me and took me to one of the most atrocious restaurants along Broadway. I can't even remember what its name is called. But the company is what mattered. Because Wendell approached me in a very specific way. He had read this Forming the American Canon, and he said, okay, you are now my sheikh. There's a point here about the tradition he situates himself in. And there's a story that is the beginning of this book, which goes back to even before he was born, but it forms him. And I'd like you to tell a bit about that story, about the Boeing aircraft factory,
Sure. Yeah.
your father, and this question, and this question of what is black study,
Yeah.
and what you're doing, and relate it to the project here of the love of knowledge, philology,
Yeah.
right? And how you begin your journey.
Sure. Sure.
Can you turn on the mic?
This is not working.
So I really appreciate this question, right? It is a biographical question, and oftentimes in our kind of academic work, the biographical is looked down upon. But in my work, and I think in Black Studies work in general, because of our appreciation for lived experience, we understand that life is a great resource, right, for our thinking, and ultimately, I think it is a goal of our work, right? It's not disembodied. And so for me, this project begins with my father in a lot of ways. When he is, he's born in Atlanta, in Savannah, but he grows up in Atlanta, goes to one of the 3 black high schools in the city, and, he is not really offered an education for living and for life. And he ultimately is working at a aircraft manufacturer in Atlanta after his education, and his job is to stir paint, right? That is his occupation. And one day, one of his fellow black coworkers asks him if he can read what's written on the plane in the distance. It was a plane that was headed to Saudi Arabia, as I understand the story, and it had the Saudi flag, right, which has on it the Shahada, the profession of faith, right? La ilaha illallah. And when my father's coworker kind of tells him, he asks, can he read it? And my father says no. And then he reads to him what was written. And my father's really kind of amazed that, here's a guy, very much like him, who can not only read other languages and other scripts, right, but then also knows a name of God that he is unfamiliar with. And for my father, this was the beginning of an intellectual awakening in the way that he always told the story to me, right? So throughout his education, he had never read a book from cover to cover, right? In all of his education. But it was only after working in this factory that he had started attending lessons in history and theology with the Nation of Islam outside of Atlanta, that he actually came to read a book cover to cover. And for me, growing up, this was a remarkable understanding of an encounter with knowledge, because I grew up in a house full of books, right? I grew up in Atlanta coming to bookstores like this one, right? Madhu, Shrine of the Black Madonna. But in his kind of self-narration, he said it wasn't always the case. And it was this encounter with Islam that, that he was introduced to this idea of knowledge and of learning. And so for me growing up, my father never converted to Islam. And yet it was so meaningful for him that, I'm named after a companion of the Prophet, Hassan ibn Thabit, my middle name. And it was a part of a constellation of our household, some awareness and some idea of what Islam was, and this association with it as being knowledge. And really, in some fundamental ways, that's kind of the seed of this project.
I asked you this question because I knew that was the answer you'd give, and also as a way of opening up part of what's going on with the book. The story you tell of biography, right, is a fundamental story of a life and a story of knowledge. And it's a story of the ways in which the transmission of knowledge enable a particular kind of liberation in spite of the structures of power. So in the story of Shaykh Kamara, for example, biography or autobiography is important. And it indeed functions as a text that can sustain and eventually articulate problematically a notion of anti-colonial, some will say colonial, Senegalese identity. And it does so in this tradition of transmitting structures of knowledge. The other reason I wanted to hear that story is it foregrounds the way in which that structure of knowledge, that structure of learning, has been a part of Black American life since forever, including the Islamic element, which may not be theological, but indeed is fundamentally intellectual in thinking. And you can find it on the street corner, you can find it on the streets outside here, you can find it on the walls of this bookstore, you can find it in the way in which people live. So I want you to speak a bit about the ways in which you make a connection between the story you tell here of how Senegalese scholars were able to sustain a particular account of what it was to be Senegalese through the preservation of a set of text and through the preservation of stories of transmission and ways of telling stories and Black studies and Black people. So that you can give us a sense of why this book that's focused so specifically on Senegal and focused so specifically on the question of love, of learning and languages is relevant for the shelves of sources of knowledge for the streets of Newark. And in answering that question as well, I want to burden you a bit more because I want you to share with them as well the aardvark story, because that's key. It's another illustration of the transmission of learning.
Should I start with the aardvark?
It's your choice.
Okay. So this is actually some really big questions that we could spend a lot of time on. But maybe I will start with the aardvark because it does stage for us some of the work that I'm doing. So in the autobiography of Malcolm X, there is the figure of the aardvark, right? We kind of, in the biopic, Spike Lee made in, I think, 92, this scene, this moment in the autobiography is visualized for us, right? And it's, Denzel Washington playing Malcolm X. He's reading a dictionary, right? And in the actual autobiography, the discussion that Malcolm X is having with Alex Haley is kind of comes up as a memory when he's trying to explain what was his own intellectual awakening was like when he was in prison, when Malcolm X was imprisoned. And the aardvark is this image that he remembers as kind of standing in for this period in his life of coming to study, right? Which Malcolm describes as being this moment in his life when he had never been as free as he was when he was imprisoned once he was engaged in study, right? And so the aardvark for me is, and I think there's an entire kind of tradition of understanding the aardvark as this symbol. When you look at the Encyclopedia Africana, right, that is edited by Henry Louis Gates and Appiah, what you see, they actually start with the aardvark as well. At the first entry in this encyclopedia, for the ways that it represents, like the beginning of knowledge. And what is interesting about the story of the aardvark in my mind, it's a weird image, but when you kind of follow it through and you read it along the grain of the autobiography and the kind of testimony that Alex Haley gives in the epilogue of the autobiography, there is a discussion of philology, right? Malcolm X says that philology is a tough science, all about how a word can lose its shape, but you can still recognize its identity, right? And so for me, I think this is one way of understanding Malcolm's theory of diaspora, right? And it's also just a model for the ways in which he is a philological thinker, right? There's a kind of verbal way that he's trying to reconstruct history and to connect the different parts of the African body, if you will. So the philology as, we often think of philology as the study of, language, history, texts. It's a kind of we often think of it as an antiquated discipline. But paradoxically, what I'm saying in this book in part is that read along with Malcolm X, philology gives us some kind of interesting ways in to read against the grain of more, kind of dominant discourses about the past. Is that sufficient?
Well, no, but no, you didn't answer the second question, but I'm going to come back to that, right? I'm going to add here that
I knew he was going to give me a hard time for that one. But.
Yeah, well, of course, forgive me for being pedantic for only a moment, but just to make sure we're all on the same page. Philologia is a Greek term, right? And it means love of discourse, right? Love of discourse. It's also a term in the formation of the modern state that plays a fundamental role on the premise that the language that people use and the literature that they use it in expresses their way of being in the world, which of course in the German context is going to be the basis for the formation of the state. Now here in this book, Wendell makes a very important intervention that puts him at odds with area studies and political science, and also with literary studies, in that he tracks the way in which the French, in the case of Morocco and in the case of Senegal, used the methods of philology to colonize and to taxonomize the population and to try and colonize their literary structures and indeed arrive at this ridiculous invention called Black Islam in the course of it. And then after the Cold War, when the United States comes to be the dominant force, there's a shift that takes place from the love of language and learning to numbers, right, to area studies, and to management of populations as aggregates. And so in the book, he points out how the continuation of the philological practices within the Islamic context were acts of resistance, were acts of rebellion, which he ties to Malcolm X. He's being shy. In the book, he doesn't so much, but it's there in the footnotes, right? And that was the second part of the question you didn't answer, and that's the connection to Black studies and to Black life. Going back to your remarks about lived experience and the way you kept using the word biography, autobiography, biography, right? The way that we tell these stories, and whether or not this case in Senegal in the late 19th and early 20th century has any bearing on how we try to imagine ourselves. Because that's the crux of that story about philology with Shaykh Kamara. It's a story of self-creation, right? Through poetic expression, right? We call it autopoiesis, right? Self-institution in the face of tremendous oppression, and in a method that challenges it by insisting on thinking on its own terms, in its own way, and maintaining its own possibilities. That's the question I want you to answer. What's the connection?
Yeah. I think I find this to be a difficult question because when I started the research, I didn't know what the connection was, right? I had an intuition that kind of, partly because of family background, partly because of some experiences I had already had in Senegal and in West Africa, that I knew that there was something important and relevant, and I didn't know what it was. I didn't know how to make the connections. And so I just started by studying and reading and allowing it to kind of take me in different paths, right? So originally, when I started my graduate training, I was very interested in Hajj Omar Tal, right, as a historical personality, right? Hajj Omar Tal was one of the most important Sufi figures of the 19th century. He was affiliated with the Tijaniya Sufi order, right? And Sufism is this tradition within Islam that emphasizes experience of the divine, right, or a taste of the divine. And Hajj Omar, in addition to being a Sufi, he was this incredible intellectual, very prolific writer, and he established a short-lived state in areas between now Guinea, Mali, Songhai, and he had such an impact that people like Edward Blyden, I saw the right here, Christianity, Islam, and the Negro Race, right? One of the kind of founding figures of Pan-African thought, right, mentions Hajj Omar as a kind of example of the African personality, right? So he's writing at the end of the 19th century. He's paying attention to people, thinkers like Hajj Omar Tal, who's active in kind of very much the mid 19th century, partly because when Blyden is, who's from the Caribbean, but of course goes to Sierra Leone and is active in kind of Anglophone West African politics, right? He meets and encounters Tijani scholars, and he appears to have studied with them, right? And so I knew that there were some connections in understanding the tradition of Black thought, and studying Hajj Omar was a way in. And so for a long time, I was trying to study his works, right? Very challenging, very sophisticated doctrinal texts. And I somehow along the way ended up with one of the biographies of Hajj Omar, right? Ash'al al-Ulum wa Tayyib al-Khabar fi Sirat al-Hajj Omar, the most delicious of the news and the tastiest of the sciences and the life of Hajj Omar. And this was written by Shaykh Musa Kamara, right? And in a practical way, the text was just more accessible to me. I could understand it better than some of the texts by Hajj Omar. And around the same time as I was reading this text, this would have been around 2013, 2014, Kamara was also being rediscovered in Senegal, right? Now, as I argue in the last chapter of the book, between 2013 and 2023, more had been published by or about Kamara in that 10-year period than in any other 10-year period while Kamara was alive or since he perished, right? And so he had come back, he had made a comeback in some ways, long after he died in 1945. Now in 2014, 2015, when I was going back and forth in Senegal, scholars were talking about him and books were being published. Okay, So why was that? Well, Kamara, one of the many texts that he writes, was a invalidation of jihad as a legitimate practice without prophetic leadership, right? So this is in the context of West Africa, after the fall of Libya and the Arab Spring, and the way the kind of geopolitics of the region had really seen, it became a very different landscape. And we saw the coup in Mali in 2012, and the kind of question of Muslim politics and what forms it might take took on a militant shape, right? And the fact that here was a West African Muslim scholar who spoke against kind of a militant Islamist politics, or what could be construed as militant Islamist politics, he became really attractive. And so he began to circulate in that moment for a very different set of reasons than I originally came to him for, right? Now, what's interesting is that as I had these very kind of arcane interests in Hajj Omar and that intellectual tradition, Kamara is being cited as a very relevant figure. And I'm talking to Senegalese scholars, and they're telling me okay, you're interested in this minor text, which is the biography of Hajj Omar. You should really read Kamara's autobiography, Tabshil Khaif, right? The announcement of the fearful one, right? And at first, I try to take a look at it. There wasn't a published edition at that point. I went to the archives and I struggled trying to read it. I had gotten a copy that was a very poor Xerox, right? But I kind of put it to the side. I kept reading the biography of Hajj Omar, and it wasn't until I started working on this book a few years ago that I went back to the autobiography. By this point, a critical edition had been published, and that enabled, my work. It facilitated my work in a great way. So I'm kind of telling that story of how I came into it as a way of responding to your question of its relevance. And I'm attending to, in a lot of ways, the conversations and the kind of intellectual debates that have been going on in Senegal in the last 15 years or so, as I've come with my own questions that come from a different branch of the tradition.
It's very nice. So here's my interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it's quite interesting, right? Of course, Edward Blyden, or Umar, established a school of Arabic in Sierra Leone. He studied Arabic in Beirut and was a prominent figure in Black thought with Du Bois and with Martin Delany. And given your age, only a Negro boy in Atlanta would know about it. Right? This long tradition of radical Black thought, right? And that's how you come across Umar Tal. This is not inconsequential. What you're calling your own baggage is a particular kind of call and response in which a trace element of things that have been going on in Senegambia and get brought here still circulate, hence the story of your father. And we could talk about even your uncle, and hence the story of your encountering Blyden, right? It's like when I came across Ben Ali as a Muslim in that manuscript, right? That there's a set of questions that we're trying to sort out in terms of our own history in relationship with our elders. And we belong within chains of transmission. It's not. You just told the story of your train of transmission. It's important that you come to the Sublime, right? And of course, Tal is amazing with his the opening of his dream, and it opens up all kinds of things, and in a way that is not ethnographic. And let me explain what I mean by that, and you tell me if I've got you right or wrong. The Africanist study of these things treats them as objects of analysis, not as moments in a conversation across time of thinkers and thinking that speaks life experience, right? That engages lived experience and opens up its possibilities. You came to Tal through that tradition of lived experience, where it wasn't as an object of analysis, but as a question. Who am I? Who are we? Wow, who's this black guy talking about this stuff? What does it mean that the same man who was saying that the way in which America can best colonize Africa is through Islam, who's saying Tal is the quintessential African because of his literacy, at a moment in which the general view was there's no literacy there, right? There's no learning there. You're asking that question from that traditional perspective. That's not ethnographic. That's what I was after. That's what I think is really profound about how this book relates to us, because it's a continuation in your writing of the same practice, right? So that when we read this, and it's fairly easy in its style. He throws around the word philology, that's okay. Right? But he does it in a very careful way, and even when he gives you the Arabic titles, he breaks them down as you're going along, because he's talking with you. Right? And it's a text that clearly has in mind his fellows, his sisters, the children, to make this an aspect of this tradition that he's introduced, as we all are, through our parents. That's the answer I was looking for, but you're too shy.
Well, I'm glad I have you to bring that out. You know.
Did I make it up and get it wrong?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think it fundamentally, so much of my work has been a rejection, a refusal, a temper tantrum with, African studies as area studies, right? And the kind of ethnographic paradigm, right? This is the same kind of idea that Toni Morrison talks about, right? In her famous playing in the dark, right? That there's a certain way that of reading Black writers, which is tantamount to not reading them, right? That there's a kind of way of extracting life out of a text so as to vivisect, right? To kind of deaden and to render into objects, right? And I've was trained in an area studies department, critical area studies, but at the end of the day, still an area studies department. And I had to contend with these kind of dominant paradigms. And it's very challenging because, you go into that space and, especially when you start, something's not right. Something's not right, but, you don't have any authority to really say that it's not, or you don't necessarily know how to make the critique, right? But it's not right, and you're trying to do something else. And so this book, and my training in general, has been trying to find ways to fundamentally read these kind of authors, West African authors of Arabic texts, right? Very naively, when I started graduate school, I wanted to be a scholar of a literature that was not in a European language. It was very basic. I wanted to read a non-Europhone kind of African world literature, right? And in some ways, that shouldn't be so hard a thing to do, and yet it was very hard, and it was very hard to find teachers, right? And so when you came to Columbia and you spoke at that Fanon conference, it wasn't a plan to kind of take Be'ah. But, spontaneously, I understood, having read Disforming the Canon in Cairo 2 years before, right, that this was, you were someone who, had done what I was dreaming to do, and that I needed that guidance to learn how to do it, because not just anyone can teach you how to kind of read in these traditions. And so, thankfully, I think what I've been able to do in this text is to offer commentaries of texts by and about Kamara over the course of his life, and kind of since he died, that allow people to kind of access this part of the tradition. And what I really recently I've been thinking about, it's kind of a cliche, but this was really the book that I wanted when I started graduate school, right? It was not at all what I was trying to do when I wrote this book, but I was thinking kind of recently, reflecting on it, I was like, it's really just like the book I was looking for and could not find to start my graduate education. And so hopefully it can kind of serve that in.
Thank you. Thank you. This is finally. This is my last remark, and it's going to be a bit over the top, but you know what lyric says. LB says, I'm going to take it too far, take it way too far. Of course, this book also points out warnings, because its closing chapters are about the pitfalls of national consciousness, which has to do with precisely the ways in which Kamara's work gets utilized by the state against popular movements, right? And that's an important object lesson. But I want to underscore what I was trying to tease out of him before, and he gave a bit about, and that's procedure, and that's style. Style matters. We all know this, right? As Zora Neale Hurston explained about, the Negro characteristic, we're a styleful people, right? This lived experience, you got to walk the walk and talk the walk with a certain rhythm. And so procedure and approach matter, right? So I wrote this book in 1990, got published in 92, called Disforming the American Canon. It was the first translation of the lengthiest so-called slave narrative we have of a man named Umar bin Ali, who wrote it in Arabic. And it became a very important object of ethnographic study and became the basis of Greenberg's theory. And even Gates talks about it, and most of it's nonsense because they didn't know Arabic and didn't know the tradition. And in fact, it was a very particular remembering of a certain passage of a seditious text from the African region, Risalat al-Qarawani, which was a Sunni text at a moment of the Shia Fatimid Empire. So Ben Ali's writing it was a reenactment of rebellion and sedition in literary form, right? And I wrote this in a very particular high style, because I'm a comparativist by training, and I studied with Godzich and others, and I'm a philosopher and all of that. And I wrote it to be an intellectual intervention to bring black thinking into the context of mainstream thinking, and it got Bantustanized, as Sylvia Winter's term. Oh, look at the face of the author. Oh, this is a book in black. Put it there, right? And that's where it dwelt for a long, long time, right? And I won't go into the stories of what happened to it, but the point is his story. So this young man who has this procedure of following and looking for the elders in the black tradition, his father, Biden, I won't admit to being an elder.
Blyden.
Blyden. I said Biden, didn't I? See, that reveals I am an elder. I am 70, so I guess I'm getting those moments, right? Blyden. Forgive me, you know. Anyways, that's where he went looking, right? This quest he had for this book and this project he wanted, he didn't trust Columbia. He didn't accept the taxonomy. So I'm sitting there eating the crummy steak, and this young man begins to recite the passages from the text as if he had gone to my alma mater, Al-Azhar. I'm saying, wow, this is a serious young man. Right? This is a serious young man. And not recite it he doesn't give beer, he doesn't give alliance and all of that. But to say, let's talk. Right? I think we have something to talk about. And he's done that with every scholar he's worked with. And it's important that he does this with the black scholars as well as the white scholars, and he takes them serious, which is one of the reasons why his work sort of stands in a particular limbo, because it's unwavering in that kind of comparative movement. People don't know what to do with it, and that's the best part of it, because that's how it's groundbreaking. It breaks the taxonomy, not just of area studies, but of humanities studies. And it says, okay, from this black perspective, we're going to do something different, and we're going to mind what we're doing, right? So that's my spiel. I think he's done a good job of explaining the source of the book. I hope you buy it. It's well worth it. It's worth its weight in gold. It will be a very, very important work. And it doesn't have to be important because the press celebrates it, but because you all engage in its conversation.
Well, thank you for that. I don't know what to say after that.
You paid for dinner.
Yeah.
You paid for dinner. That was.
Which one? I paid for dinner.
You paid for the cab.
instead.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So I think we should probably maybe open it up. Yeah. Okay. All right. So questions. Come back to it. Yeah.
I haven't read the book yet, but I've been in conversation with Wendell for a long time and heard you speak about the book a bunch. And so I'm wondering if you could talk about, it seems like you bring the book to today and to some of our challenges around how knowledge is being reconfigured right now and sort of the algorithmic and AI. And I'm just wondering if you could, I don't have a particular question, but I would just be curious to hear more about how you take this journey and then bring us to those insights, especially in terms of the love of learning, but the love of reading in particular. And I have a lot of fears about that, so yeah.
Yeah. So thanks for that question, because it allows me to do a more basic kind of overview of the book, right? Which I describe as a parable of the fate of the humanities amid political, technological, and epistemic change, right? Through the life and work of a understudied Muslim intellectual from French West Africa, Francophone West Africa, right? And what I mean by all of that is that at the heart of the book is the story of Kamara's effort to publish a bilingual edition of a monumental history of West Africa. Really a macro history of the universe from West Africa, right? But the focus ultimately is, right? This was his text called Zuhur Bassatin, right? Flowers from Among the Gardens in the History of the Blacks, right? Which was written in the 1920s and really flies in the face of the colonial discourses that represented Africa as being without writing and without history, right? The reason why it's a parable and why it's a lesson for our times today, right, in this moment when we're in political, technological, and epistemic change, is that when he first writes the book, that it is initially received with a great enthusiasm by a group of colonial bureaucrats, right? These colonial bureaucrats had been trained in the Algerian school, right, which meant that they were trained in Arabic, and that they took seriously the textual traditions of Islam, right, and kind of considered West Africa as a part of this tradition, right? Now, there were there were a number of developments that prolonged the publication, beginning with the fact that the first translator of the text dies in 1926, and the first manuscript is lost. And so he has to write it a second time, right? Which he does. And what ultimately happens, though, is that this process takes so long that by the time, really about 15 years passes, and the book still hasn't been translated, and he's getting older, and he wants to be, paid, right? Because there were promises that he would be paid for this work, that the colonial state would publish it. And but it doesn't happen. But by this point, there's a new generation of colonial bureaucrats who were not trained in Arabic. They were trained in ethnographic surveillance, right? And so this whole business of having to go read some text to understand the history and the culture and the language of the subject population is actually irrelevant, when you can just, spy on them, right? Observe them, right? That this ethnographic orientation. And so in a lot of ways, this monumental work gets lost in between two different regimes of knowledge. The first one was Orientalist, in the sense that it read and studied Arabic texts. And the second one was part and parcel of the kind of new colonial state after the Second World War, which was very much kind of mechanized, right? Statistical, right? And the work is lost. And yet, right, we're talking about Kamara today, right? And in between, there are a number of developments where Kamara kind of comes back in the 1970s in Senegal. And then, like I said earlier, he comes back in 2013. And what I'm saying is, if you kind of track these returns, there's an insight about the nature of humanistic knowledge, right? That there is always at least a potential for a return. And so, like, Kamara teaches us that the fate of the humanities is actually quite promising, right? Now, of course, I'm not talking about an institutional arrangement, right, in which there's a crisis in the labor market, right? That is a different consideration, which, organized labor in higher education has to take up. But in terms of like the broader horizons, that I do believe that there is something, if we understand the humanities as an attitude, right, what I call the textual attitude, which is an orientation to the world, right, one that is interpretive, then there remains a place for it. And that's the kind of big picture message that I offer in this book. Sorry.
Yeah, I want to add to the story that's being told here, because, and bring it back to the question of institutions as well. So I chaired the committee that hired Wendell. And that was, no, I'm very annoyed that Rutgers screwed that up and you have left. But we'll come to that in a second. And I worked very hard with John, at least part of that. For 2 years I sat on Wendell's file, because R.A. told me about this extraordinary young man at Columbia. And I think this is part of the story, and I want this to be part of the story of this book, in this space in Newark. I've taught here for 17 years. And I sat on that file for 2 years. And for 2 years I fought the administration and said that if we were going to do hires in Islam, we could not avoid hiring somebody who was black and who also worked in black Islam or Islam in Africa. And it was a hell of a fight.
And put in the Afrikaners.
And it had to be put, and this person had to be in the Africana department. And you were there because you watched that fight, and it was a 2-year-long fight. I had a nervous breakdown pretty much, metaphorically almost after that. But so it took 2 years, and part of the idea was also to design an Islam in the Humanities cluster that was against security studies. I worked with God knows how many people to design that. R.A. and I were in conversation regularly. John and I were in conversation. And Wendell's case was an inspiration because we wanted to think through how to reimagine the humanities, which is one of my dear projects. It was a brutal couple of years, and the aftermath was horrible, and so much so that I basically disappeared from campus for 4 years. Wendell, fast forward 5 years later, it's a beautiful book, which actually does reimagine the humanities in ways that we could not have fully conceived, but we sort of hoped for and intimated, and John's nodding his head, so he knows exactly what you're talking about. And we were so excited. And then the institution kicks in and basically fumbles it and refuses to retain Wendell when he gets an outside offer. So we lose it, Wendell. So part of the point I'm trying to make is that we're sitting here having this conversation in this space in Newark at the institution, right next to the institution where he was working. But the point I want to make at this moment in America is also that sometimes the state doesn't have to do anything if the institutions that we're working in do the work for the state before the state can even do it. Yeah. Right? So there's a lot of hand-wringing and a lot of screaming and shouting and crying about what the state is doing to the university today, but what the university has been doing to itself, and what it's been doing to its people, and what it's been doing to the humanities, and what this university has been doing to itself for the past God knows how many years, is already deplorable. Letting Wendell go was shocking and absolutely deplorable. I say this as somebody who fought to get him here. I haven't been here for 4 years. I don't really care, really. I'm sort of sick of the institution. But I'm glad he's having this conversation here. The work will continue. The fact that it will continue elsewhere is our tragedy. But I'm glad it will continue. I'm very sorry we lost you, but I'm glad we're here. You don't have to say anything. I just have to say it.
I think there was a couple of Yes.
So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about Kamara's own training and his peers that were with him at the time. Sorry, I'm nervous. And also how it was that his biography and work were passed on from the moment of his death, because that made it possible for a rediscovery.
Yeah. So these are core questions. So the first question, just so we all hear it, is kind of to speak about Kamara's training and his peers, and then also about the transmission of his work. So in terms of his training, right, there's actually some great accounts that he includes in his own autobiography of when he was a Quranic student as a child, right? Apparently he had a perfect memory, right? He had a photographic and phonographic memory. Whether he saw something or heard it, he would remember it in full, right? Now, what's interesting is that, this intellectual tradition, especially in West Africa, is one that really values memorization, right? And so if to be a good scholar, top scholar, you have to have had a strong memory. And he had that, right? And one of the first things that you're expected to memorize, of course, is the Quran, right? It is the foundation and the paradigm of all further study. And yet, in his autobiography, Kamara says, I never memorized the Quran, right? Which is a remarkable statement for so many reasons, right? Given the context. He also studied, usually in this tradition, you kind of find a teacher. After your kind of elementary level, you go on to then study a particular text, right? Whether it's the kind of Risala, on kind of jurisprudence, or if it's a particular work of tafsir, you study the entire text. You listen, you hear it, right? You hear it being read, and ultimately you're authorized to then teach it by reading, which includes a commentary, right? Kamara would start his studies with a master teacher, and then stop, and then find someone else, right? So he was very kind of independent-minded in a context that values actually really being a disciple. But he didn't do that. He was very idiosyncratic in that way. But he still managed to kind of travel in all the major centers of Islamic learning between Senegal, Mauritania, and Guinea, and a lot of the kind of major names of the period are people that he would have studied with at some point, but he was very independently minded until he had a dream. And the prophets Ibrahim and Muhammad appear to him. He was about the age of 21 and 22, right? And the prophet Ibrahim basically tells him, I don't know what you're doing, you're on the wrong path, right? And then he disappears, and then the prophet Muhammad appears. And he says, what did he say to you? And he, very worried, he says, oh, I'm not on the right path. And then the prophet Muhammad tells him, don't worry, you're on the right one, right? And then he becomes much more serious in his studies, and he goes out and seeks the Sufi master who would become his spiritual guide, Shaykh Saad Buh, and who is known to history because he was very important in kind of articulating the relationship between French colonial rule and the kind of Muslim population, right? So in that way, he was in some ways very much in the kind of elite of Muslim scholars, but at the same time, he was an outsider because he was so idiosyncratic. In Senegal today, he's remembered in his region in northern Senegal as being very important, but in kind of big urban spaces like Dakar, he's not necessarily a well-known name or figure, not like the really big shaykh like Sheikh Amadou Bamba or Ibrahim Niasse, who have millions of people, followers from all over the world, right? He's not remembered like one of those figures. And some people say it's because he was of enslaved origin, of enslaved descent. There's been some very good work by people like Abdul Malal Diop, who kind of brings the receipts and says that's not the case. And I find that convincing, but what I'm more interested in is the fact that this accusation of slave descent can be mobilized to discredit someone who was independently minded and who was kind of critical of a certain scholarly establishment. And so he's a really peculiar figure in terms of the Muslim intellectuals of his day. He was generally respected as being a remarkable scholar, but also kind of people kept their distance because he was so idiosyncratic.
Yet the work is transmitted.
Yeah, and yet his work is transmitted. Thanks for bringing me to the second part of that question. So the most important factor in the reason why we have his manuscripts is because, I told you that he didn't, he had to write his manuscript a second time. At a certain point, as he's kind of approaching the end of his life, and he's not getting published, he actually asks, do I need to write this a third time? Because for a moment, there seems that one was lost as well. It's eventually found, but it was up in the air for a time. And toward the end of his life, he was looking for a chapter from the major work, and for several months, he's looking for it in his library, and he can't find it. Eventually, he finds it, and he pulls it out, and he sees that it's been eaten by termites. And what he realizes is that, okay, I need to do something with these, because perhaps one day some person somewhere might read this. And so he actually gives several of his manuscripts, not all of them, to the newly minted Institut Français d'Afrique Noire, IFAN, one of the most important research centers in Francophone West Africa. And so in that archive, where most of his works are still collected today, the family has other manuscripts of his and that are accessible. They've recently kind of established a Kamara research center in his village of Gangel on the border with Mauritania. But if you really want the kind of details of the transmission, the chapter 4 and chapter 5 of the book kind of really gives you the details. But that donation to the colonial institution, which is kind of paradoxical given the fact that they had lost his manuscripts before, it played a big role in the actual manuscripts. And then besides that, the memory of him, because he was kind of a Sufi master, was transmitted within the family. And that memory has been preserved in that way.
One more question, maybe?
Yeah. Okay.
No. I'm saying that we have time for one more question. I'm getting a sign from.
So this is a fairly basic question, but I think it relates to the genealogy that R.A. pointed out and your wonderful comments about how this relates to the fate of the humanities. But I guess we've talked about this a little bit. Is how what are the stakes for in your mind for black study and black studies?
Mm-hmm.
Right? How does this open up, let's say, a new? Because I think it does a new paradigm for how we think about black studies going forward, particularly at this moment in time.
Yeah. I really appreciate this question because I do see it as a work of black studies and a work for black studies, right? It's kind of global scope is a big part of that, right? That I think black studies has been, is, and should be planetary in its orientation. And I think this is what I'm doing in this work. And also, it is multilingual, right? So much of my training has been in, French and Arabic and Pular, and Wolof, and bringing that kind of multilingual orientation is really kind of almost practical, institutional dimensions that I think it points us towards. But then more deeply, understanding the work, and as a work of philology, which I gloss as the love of study, is that, I think there's a broader current in Black studies right now that is thinking about, what we do beyond the university, right? By necessity, I think that we need to think about autonomy from the university and really thinking about substantively the work that we do, qualitatively maybe is maybe the better word, like the quality of the work that we do and our commitments in that work, not being defined by professional considerations, right? Those are the kind of elements that I really want to put on the table for Black studies. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I just want to thank you all so much for coming out. I didn't even dream of such an audience and such a outpouring of support, and I'm really grateful for your presence. And I see so many faces that I've been interacting with and learning from and building with over the past 7 years since being at Rutgers, and it means so much to me to be here with you all to celebrate this work. And it's just really beautiful. So I want to thank you all, and I also really want to thank Christina. Where is she?
Working.
She's working?
Of course she's working. Yes.
Who really insisted that we do this.
Yep.
And I'm really glad that we did. I'm so grateful for you, Christina.
She's not going to come.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
There she is.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you. And really and truly, because you've taken care of me for 7 years in amazing ways.
Don't make me cry.
Yeah.
Turn back around. Go ahead.
And I also just want to thank Masani and Patrice for hosting us as well. And I'm no longer in Newark, but anything to support the work that you all do, from afar, I'm very happy to do it. This is I grew up in spaces like this, and I'm very committed to continuing to support it. So just want to say thank you all.
Thank you for your work.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, you've thanked all the people
Yeah.
that I was going to thank, so thank you for doing that. But I want to thank you, Wendell, really, your presence here. Can you hear this? Yes.
Yeah.
So your presence at Rutgers Newark in my first couple of years was phenomenal, and we definitely miss your energy in Conklin, and you've already left a legacy. So thank you and congratulations
Thank you.
on this amazing.
Thank you.
We of course want to thank R.A. Judy for this amazing conversation with Wendell. So thank you again for that. And as Wendell already says, Source of Knowledge has been a partner for many years, and we thank you again for your partnership that we hope to continue well into the future. Other sponsors include this, the Institute for the Global Racial Justice. We want to thank them as well. The Mellon Foundation's Soya Seminar for their sponsorship. And without their support, this would not happen. And of course, I was going to say to Christina again, who is the brain behind most things that happen in Africana, no matter who the chair is. And so thank you again, Christina. For all the students who are here, I hope, I would love to say, look under your chairs. You will find a book. But all the students who are here, thank you for coming. You will get a free book today. So just check with Christina on the way out. And there is food. Please partake of food. And I don't know how long you will be here to talk to people individually.
Until they kick me out.
Okay. So please eat, drink. No, drink no. Eat, drink water. Yes, this is something. There is drinks, right? Yeah, but not that. It's a Friday. Thank you very much, and one more round of applause for Wendell.
Thank you all.